Hello and welcome to another episode of Bicep for Real. We've got another new Bicep feature, so we're going to have another new video. And this week we're going to be looking at Entra ID resources. So up until very recently, it wasn't possible for you to create Entra ID, Azure AD, whatever you want to call it, resources using Bicep. It's been like that for many, many years. So whenever you needed to create Entra ID resources, you had to resort to other means. Quite a common way of doing it was using a deployment script. So you would have the Bicep create the deployment script, which would run some PowerShell, which would then create the Entra ID resources. Maybe you did it in a pipeline step in Azure DevOps, part of your deployment. You had to work around the problem. However, a few weeks ago, Microsoft released an extension for Microsoft Graph for Bicep, which means we can now create Entra ID resources using our Bicep code. Now, this is in preview at the time of this video, which is June 2024, and it's missing some features. There is a limit in terms of what you can create. So, for example, you can't create users at the moment. That's obviously a fairly fundamental thing that people are probably going to want to do, but at the moment you can't do that. There are a few other things, bits and pieces you can't do as well. I'm sure there's going to be added over time, but right now I think it's a good time for us to demo that and add that into our infrastructure. Let's take a look at how you can use the provider and how we're going to implement that in our deployment for our Lambda Toys resources. So let's hop over to VS Code. So here we are over in our VS Code. And we're going to do a couple of things today. So what we want to do is, if you remember, we've got in our main Bicep, we've got this key vault, which we're pulling in from the outside. This is an existing key vault. What we want to do is we are going to create a service principal in Entra ID, and we want it to have rights on that key vault to be able to read secrets. So we're going to create a service principal. What we're also then going to do is we're going to create a group, because it's not the best practice in the world to grant service principals direct access onto the key vault. What we want to do is we'll grant access to the key vault to the group, and then the service principal will be in the group. And that way, if we need to add any future resources that need access, we can just use that group for that. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to use our Entra ID extension to be able to do that. Now, before we can do any of that, we need to actually enable the feature. So because this is a preview feature, it's not enabled by default, and we need to enable the experimental feature for this called extensibility. What we're going to do is we are going to go ahead and do that. And to do that, we need to create a bicep config.json file. So this bicep config file needs to sit either in the same folder as your bicep folder or in a parent folder above it. So we're going to create it in here. So we're going here, new folder, new file even, sorry, and it's called bicep config.json. And then what we need to put in here is the experimental features enabled and then extensibility, and set that to true. And then we'll go ahead and save that. And that's ready to go. So that's all we need to do. That's the only prerequisite, other than you will need to update your version of Bicep on your machine if you haven't already done that. So next we're going to create a new module. So we'll create a new file in here. We'll call it entra.bicep. And that's where we're going to create the resources. Now we're going to need some parameters here. So we need to pass in the name of that key vault, because that's what we're going to use that to grant access to the key vault. So actually we're going to want the key vault, probably want the key vault ID, I think. So the next thing we need to do is we need to add the provider. So providers are the ways that you actually tell it that we want to use Azure Entra ID. So that we will do provider Microsoft Graph is a provider we want to use. And that just declares that we're going to consume that provider. Right, so let's create a few things. Now, because of some of the limitations in the graph provider, one of those is there doesn't appear to be the way at the moment to add users or service principals to groups after you create the group. You can add them during the group creation, but that's obviously a one-off task. You can't do it again later. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to create the service principal first, and then we're going to create the group and add that service principal. Graph resources look just like normal Azure resources, but with a different provider. So first up, we're going to create the actual app registration that's needed for creating a service principal. So as normal, use the resource keyword. We're going to give it a name. So we'll call it our Lambda Secrets app. And then the type, instead of using Microsoft whatever the other resources we use are, this is going to be Microsoft.graph as the provider, and then we want applications. And then the version, rather than using a date-based versioning like we do for the Azure resources, this is the graph version, and that's version 1. And then there are various properties, obviously, that you can add here. We're going to use the bare minimum we need because the application isn't really doing a lot other than the fact that it needs to exist for a service principal. So we need the display name property. I'll call that lambda secret set, that's fine. We need the sign-in audience, say Azure AD my.org, which is basically this is a single tenanted application. And we need a unique name, which again can be that. And that's the bare minimum you need for application. Now, obviously, if you were using the application for things like Entra ID authentication and those sort of things, then you would need more details in there. But we're not doing that. So the next piece is we want to create the service principal itself. So we're going to go resource and we're going to call it lambda secrets SP. And again, Microsoft.graph. And this one we need is service principals. Again, v1. I'll let Copilot fill in that, but we don't need much of that. So we can get rid of all of those app roles because we're not using it for actual authentication. So the app ID is pulled correctly. It's pulling that from the actual application. And then the other thing we need is a display name. And that actually needs to match the one up above. So we're going to call it app. There we go. Okay, and that's all we need to create the service principal. Again, there are more options if you need them. Now we're going to create the group. So let's call it secret access group. And again, Microsoft Graph, but this time it's groups. And then name, mail enabled, which we're going to set to false. This, annoyingly, even if you set mail enabled to false, you've still got to set mail nickname. So we set that to the same. Security enabled, so it is a security group. That's what we want. We need a unique name again, which can be the same. And then we want to set the members. And inside that, we are going to place that service principal. Now, another thing we can also do if we want to is, put a comma in there for, we can also set the owners, and we can set that to lambda secrets SP as well. So that's just the owner of the group. If you want to set that to a service principal, maybe you want to programmatically add members to that later. But that's it. So what we've got there is Bicep code that will go ahead and create the AAD application. It will create the service principal, and it will create the group. So the last thing we need to do is we need to grant this group permissions onto that key vault. And so we can do that with an Azure resource. So this is the role assignment resource. So let's create that first. Let's give it a name. And then this is the type on this one is, this is a normal Azure resource. So it's Microsoft authorization / role assignment. A couple of things we need to learn about doing this. So first up, when you do the role assignment, the name actually needs to be a unique GUID. It can't just be a normal string. So what we're going to do for that is we're going to use the GUID function, which is a built-in Bicep function. And you basically feed it some data to seed the creation of the GUID to make it unique. So we're going to use the resource group function to get the resource group that we are deploying into name. And then we're going to use the actual name of the secret, name of the role assignment as well. Okay, so the next is the properties section. So we give it some details of actually what we want to do with the role. So there's a couple of things we need to look at here. So first up, principal ID. This is the actual group that we're going to assign to the role. So that's the secret access group.id. There should be a space there. Oh, that's my fault. When I was cleaning something up, I removed the provider. So let's put that back in again. Right, okay, good. So the next thing we need is the principal type. And this one's going to be group because we're adding a group. And then the last one we need is the role definition ID. Now this one is slightly tricky because the role definition is a GUID. So you can see here that you've got basically the provider's Microsoft authorization role definitions type, and then this GUID indicates the particular role. Also, this is going to be complaining because you're not really supposed to use a string here. The best practice here is to actually use the resource ID function. So what we're going to do is I'm going to get Copilot to fix it because I'm lazy, and that should sort that out for me. Let's accept that. There we go. So it's using the resource ID function, the type, and then the GUID. Now this GUID is one it's picked up by default. This isn't going to be the right one. So we need to find the right GUID to use for the permission we want to grant, which is the secret reader. There is a useful tool that I use fairly regularly for finding things like this. If we switch over to the browser for a second, it's a tool called AZ Advertiser, an AZ Role Advertiser. And this gives you a list of all of the roles in Azure. And if you type in, so we're looking for Key Vault, and you can see what we want is Key Vault Secret User. That's the one we're interested in. And this is the actual GUID. So we're going to copy that, and then we're going to go back to VS Code, and we'll just replace that with this new GUID, and that gives us the right role definition. So that's all good. There's another tricky bit here. So at the moment, this module is run as part of the rest of our deployment and will run in the same resource group as the rest of our things that are getting deployed. Now, for these things we've created up here for the Azure AD, that doesn't matter. These don't exist in Azure, they're not inside the resource group, it's not a big deal. However, when we get to applying this permission here, this is going to get applied at the resource group level, and it's going to get applied to that resource group that we're deploying into. But the Key Vault we're interested in actually isn't in that resource group. It's in a different resource group because it's an already existing resource. And so we need to apply it to that Key Vault. Now, we've got a scope item that we can set on here. So if we have a look at this, there is a scope item where we can tell it what to apply to. However, that will give, if you try and set this to the scope of the Key Vault here, it will complain. It won't let you do that because you can't use the scope of a different resource group within the same file as things are getting deployed into a different resource group. You can't mix the scopes. The solution to this is easy enough for us because you do it at the module. So modules under the hood are ARM nested templates. So you're running a template within a template, and each template can run its own scope. So the solution where you need to run a resource in a different scope to what your main deployment is running at is you need to put those resources into a module and run that module at the different scope. Now, thankfully, this is already a module, and there's nothing else in here that needs to be run at that specific scope. So we can do this relatively easily. What we do is we go back to the main Bicep, and you can see we actually already do it. So when we fetch this Key Vault resource here, you can see we're already setting the scope for this to using this resource group. So actually, if we just pinch that whole line and we come down and actually, well, actually we haven't actually defined our running our module. So let's do that bit first. So we're going to do module, and we're going to call it Entra ID resources, and we're looking for entra.bicep equals doing that. I shouldn't do that. And then we'll give it a name of Entra, that's fine. We can put a dependency on core, that's fine as well. And then the parameters, that's all nonsense. So the only parameter we've got at the moment is the Key Vault ID, which is our existing Key Vault ID. We'll pass that in. And then what we want to do is set the scope, and we'll just paste in what we copied above. That's going to run in the resource group that's got the Key Vault in. So as far as everything else within that module is concerned, it's in that resource group. We don't need to know about that. So actually, we're passing in the Key Vault ID here. We actually don't need the ID. We just need the name of the Key Vault. So what we can do is, let's go back in here. Let's change this to Key Vault name. Just save that. And go back over here. This is Key Vault name. and there should be an existing key vault. I think we just called it key vault, didn't we? So if we scroll back up, I think we've already broken this down somewhere. Secret key vault name is what we need. So there we go, we're passing that in. Now, what we're going to do is we are going to copy this as well, because we want to turn that back into a key vault in our Entra folder, module folder. So if we come in here, go paste that in. The name is just key vault name, but we'll get rid of those because that's all we need. And then yeah, we've set the scope to be that key vault, so the permissions will be applied to that key vault only, and that's where we'll get granted access for this group. So just to summarize, we've got our module, we're using this Microsoft Graph provider, we've passed in the key vault name, we're looking up that key vault to get the actual key vault object, we're creating our Entra ID application, we're creating the service principal to go with it, are then creating a group, and we're adding that service principal to the group. And then finally, we're creating a role assignment that grants that group the secret reader permission onto that key vault. And that's pretty much all we need to do. So we'll just save our files, make sure we've saved the main bicep as well. And then we can go ahead and look at deploying that. Okay, so that deployment is now finished and run all the way through. And if we hop over to the Azure portal, and what we've got here, this is the key vault that that's already been created and we're going to grant permissions on. You can see now in the secret key vault users section, we've got this secret access group that's been created. If we have a look in this group and look at members, can see we've got the secrets app, which is the service principal we created. So that's all worked as expected, and we've now got Entra ID resources that have been created by our Bicep project that are working alongside Azure resources to grant permissions on that key vault. So yeah, that's how you can use the Entra ID provider for Bicep files. It's in preview, it's got some limitations, there's certain things you can't create with it. I'm sure that's going to change over the future, but it's a great start for something that people have been complaining about for a long time. Hope that made sense. If you've got any questions, feel free to drop them in comments on the video. But until the next video, I hope you have a great rest of your day.